So in a way, I wanted to talk today about kind of where we are in this. And it's not kind of inappropriate that, what we have in front of us is what's happening in a huge university system in the state of Texas. But, and then I also want to bring it back here, to this university, which has so many strengths because, here we are talking. And at the same time, it has great challenges in front of it related to free discourse and free expression and safety, quite frankly. Safety of consciousness, safety of our bodies. And safety isn't an abstract concept in queer theory. It's real. It's very unlikely that I would have had academic appointments if I had, been out aggressively. I don't think I'm that hard to spot, but I don't think it was wise to put that on my, that's not what I did my presentations on for faculty. And I don't think that you all, if you're going to go work at a law firm that's more than, a smaller, if you're into working for nonprofits, I don't think these things are going to be issues, but if you're going in any kind of corporate direction, it's still an issue. It's an issue for women, prima facie, we know that. And it's an issue for race, prima facie, we know that. And it is an issue for queer bodies as well. And then if you cross intersectionally any of those territories, it's wow. It's a dangerous thing to go and try and get a job on the basis of presenting one's own talents. Because there's the defense of the reality. And so I wanted to talk today, firstly, about where we are, and I want to talk about where we are, and some of you will recognize parts of this who've had me in other courses, but here's something that's happening as today. The Trump administration has pushed for the restriction on transgender Americans in nearly every arena, including serving the military. No measure has struck as broad and a direct blow to identity and participation in public life as a new policy on passports. And the Supreme Court has allowed this to take effect. So passports must now reflect conditions of a person's gender, sex circumstances, which is really bizarre because, as you all know, scientifically, even that is suspect to future interpretation. So there's a lot of pressure in our lives today, and I don't think it's ever not been there. We're like the frogs in the warm water. We're so used to getting fucked that if it's just, mild abuse, we tend to kind of take it. If we get a little bit of acceptance, we tend to think it's a win. I would like to take the contrary perspective on that. And I would like to suggest a beginning of our conversation, which I hope to be a conversation, and I'm going to pause and ask for clarification or interpretation throughout these 35, 40 minutes, and then kind of a check-in after we do that. There's a radical feminist that I follow in almost in an adoring way, and her name is Moni Wittig, and she's French, and she's writing early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century. And she has this piece that she calls the invocation. When I first read this, I just wept because it was an opportunity for me to actually, I felt seen by someone across time. And she said, and says to you and me today, there was a time when you were not a slave. Remember that. You say you have lost all recollection of it. Remember. You say there are no words to describe it. You say it does not exist. But remember. Make an effort to remember, or failing that, invent. Make an effort to remember, or failing that, invent. And that's how we've lived our lives as queer bodies. Because we haven't been given the history, the anthropology, the psychology, the sexuality. We haven't been given the instructions. And neither has any outside or disempowered group. You know, the place where the history and the psychology and the anthropology and the sexuality is given is in heteronormativity. It's given in white centrism. It's given in male centrism. It's given in Christocentrism. And those ideas are concretized. They're not simply provided, they're actually concretized in our culture. So much so that we internalize our own oppressors. And I'm speaking to a group who knows this. We internalize our own oppressors, and we manage our own experience from the perspective of that narrative. Good gays, good women, good people act this way, shape their bodies this way, wear their hair this way, walk this way. And yet, here we are, in our inventions. And here we are teaching a course at a university whose history is violently opposed to the existence of a queer body. Violently opposed. And that's because of us. And it's because of the people that came before us and what they were able to accomplish. So I'm talking today about a topic that the current leadership of the queer community, maybe for reasons of internalized oppression, maybe for reasons of self-interest or identity, refuse to accept. I'm talking about reinventing ourselves, recalibrating consciousness. And for most queer people, it is a valuable place to begin, because it begins with the questions: who are we? Where do we come from? And what are we here for? And I'm wondering if any of you want to talk about that for a moment, because I know outsiders have always asked these questions of ourselves. Usually laying on the floor or the ground, weeping and asking to be something else. Right? So in this reinvention possibility, who are we? Who are we? What are we here for? Where did we come from? And I'm not even talking about this metaphysically. We could. I have been practicing at the Lakota Reservation for 30 years because mainstream religion told me that I was damned. There are theologies out there where in-between people live. Dash, Winkte, Lucanias. We've been around for millennia. But who are we today? Who'd like to step into that a little bit? Who are we? Yeah.
I think part of the problem is that we've gotten so focused on labeling. Like, I feel like that need to label ourselves. If you're somebody who's born as, you're white, you're a man, you're Christian, etc., so on and so forth, you're not queer, you don't have to think about, well, which subgroups do I fall into? You're just you. You're your career, your interests, what you study, your family, your heritage, but you don't have to actively label yourself and try to explain yourself. And I think that's kind of a trap.
So are you suggesting, Max, that we are the unexplained? Are we the unnecessarily conditioned?
I think we're conditioned to label ourselves. I think we're conditioned to seek a label of who we are.
Well, and that goes on both sides, right? Because in order for us to coalesce and have any kind of political traction, we had to say who we were politically. But this question is much more is existential. So I'm interested in this kind of mash. See, you have an idea?
I think that we exist as outside, we exist as deviant, and those things cause us to yearn for a sense of belonging, but I don't think that is necessarily our place. I feel like that our place is to be deconstructors. And I think that's what queerness in a sense does, and what we exist as is that we are meant to deconstruct, or since we cannot fit into what is dominantly expected, we have two options to either fold in on ourselves and try to take an identity which protects us in relation to the world, or we choose opposite. I think a lot of problems that I have internally about this of the existential is why am I the way that I am? I think that's a very hard experience. I think especially for trans people is the need to justify my existence. Why do I live the way that I do? Why have I done the things I've done? But at the end of the day, no matter how hard I try to intellectualize it, and I feel like I can intellectualize it, the reality is that I just am.
So the question of who we are is all of that, and Wittig's insisting that we consider, kind of on the other side of our survival. that answering the question of who we are isn't a performance of survival as much, from her point of view, is it puts us in the place that the created world is needful of.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So she's saying, you know, because we know that midwifery was undone by male centrism because the healers were killed as witches. We know this. We have empirical evidence of this. Right? And we know that in many cultures you see queer people in birth, in serving in shamanic ways during times of great transitions as people who stand on both sides or 3 sides or 12 sides and kind of moving their communities into another way, right? And without the queer spirit, our university has a deep lacking.
Mm-hmm.
Our families, without our honesty in our families lack that healing. It's hard stuff. And all of us know, you know, kind of coming out in the ways that we have to come out, that's one of the hardest places. Right? But Wittig is insisting that our reality for the last 50, maybe even 70 years in the West has been trying to answer those questions. Not from the perspective of our survival, but from the perspective of where are we? Because we are here. So, because we're here, there's a reason. There's the possibility of purpose. And it's not taking on the identities or the techniques of oppressors. That's the game. That's how we are captured. That is how we are paralyzed in a circle of performance. And speaking of performance, I mean, if you look at our history, you see us in ways that served heteronormative society, but also served to prove that we were here.
Chocolate soda, please.
This kind of stuff is we're still struggling with this. You know, we're still moving through these tropes of behavior and recognition. Listen to this. This is LBJ and Hoover, who was a closet case, talking.
We got the suspicion that his mannerisms and so forth were such that they were suspicious. Yeah, he worked for me for 4 or 5 years, but he wasn't even suspicious to me. But I guess you're going to have to teach me something about this stuff. Well, you know, I often wonder what the next crisis is going to be. I swear I can't recognize them. I don't know anything about it.
I can't recognize
You just can't tell sometimes, just like in the case of this Buffalo Texas race. Yeah. There's no indication in any way. No. I know it very well, and he looked at it also, and there was no suspicion, no indication. There are some people who walk kind of funny and so forth, that you might kind of think are a little bit off.
What a threat that the President of the United States is talking to the director of the FBI about us. How to take us out. And that the effect of these things is extraordinary, and the search for the answer to those questions that are beyond the performance evaluation of those questions is more relevant for you now, perhaps, than it was even for the people before Stonewall. And I mean that because today, our dominant culture has moved us into a category of assimilation. And if we are able to perform in the same ways and at the same level of the dominant culture, then we're able to fit in and we're able to succeed. If we're not, then we are relegated to incarceration or to suicide or to economic banishment. So, in a way, queer politics has brought your generation to a threshold where you now get to consider who we are, why we're here, and where we come from in a very different way. Maybe because we have this space. And, you know, your lives are going to be profoundly altered by your answering of that question. And our political movement, to the extent that we are able to continue it from the perspective of race and gender and sexual orientation, is going to be profoundly affected by how that question is answered. So the feminist movement has already been judged as compromising its principles. Because the feminists, at least, that were writing in the Radical Times were speaking that they didn't want the jobs that men have. They didn't want the life of neo-capitalism. They didn't want to be equals. They wanted to be different. And they wanted men to be different. The same thing in the civil rights movement. It's been compromised. It's not about legal equality, because clearly that is not equal. Legal equality is not equal. And to prove it, let's all speed through South Orange with all of our complexions and see who gets in trouble. The queer movement, on the heels of those political times and those political lives, is now in that place. And we know it's in that place because politics is one more time trying to refocus its critique of the outliers. And the outliers are those that challenge the status quo in its most primary way, which is the binary. Women challenge this when they refuse to marry. Women challenge this when they refuse to have children, in a traditional way, perhaps. Maybe through adoption. Queer people challenge this in the way that we can as well, by living our question. If we don't ask this question, I think that what we'll find is the critique of the course that I teach, which is that the fight for marriage is a fight for assimilation, not liberation. And I can be a good gay if I'm married and I'm monogamous and I pay my taxes and buy things that I can't afford. And the same thing applies here at the university. You know, of your generation, what is the statistic now? Like low 20% are identifying as queer, which really doesn't have anything necessarily to do with sexual orientation. But clearly, younger people are connecting with the roles that are expected of them are not just unsatisfying, but that they are mendacious. They do bodily harm. And they replicate like a virus so that I begin, as a member of these communities, to harm myself and the people within the community. If race communities and gendered communities, conscious gender communities and queer communities coalesce, I mean, the power of that, I think, is what we're here for. Because here's the thing. We know we don't fit. We know that. Doesn't matter how we look. We know that the story doesn't fit. And existentially, what do you do with that? What are you thinking? I mean, what if this is the time? where the most could be made. And it doesn't begin with these grand gestures. It really begins in the most private recesses of consciousness. Refusing the categorization. Refusing the bondage. What are you thinking? I mean, is it your generation's time? I mean, we couldn't do a lot of that. I mean, well into my adult life, if you are making out in a car in South Mountain and you're arrested, you're put in jail, probably sexually assaulted, and charged as a sex offender. And you're making out with an adult the same way that heterosexuals are doing all over the place, right? And then everybody died with AIDS. But we did move the thing. We moved, ACT UP moved it. The police were terrified of queer spit. And so we would spit on them or spit at them, because no one knew how HIV was passed. And so they would touch you. But I think we compromised when it came to, our politics. Just let us live. And even let us get married. What are you thinking? Yeah.
I think the queer folk that came before us have set the precedent for exactly what Seanna was talking about. I mean, people did so much work for so many generations to get us to where we're at now. And now we're seeing the threat of it being taken away. And we're at a point where it's, you can either stay comfortable and try to fit into a binary or fit into a label or position, or be subversive. Try to deconstruct or deconstruct in this position we're in now.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think you said it really well.
And the deconstruction, it doesn't have to happen in we don't have to become anarchists.
No.
The deconstruction can be as simple as being true to our own way, and really standing out in this particular university community as a person who won't tolerate the abuse of anyone. Knowing that we can so very quickly find ourselves abused. I mean, one of the ugliest facts of the binary is that queer resistance is usually confronted with sexual assault. So that the most powerful weapon is to be arrested, because that is what's going to happen. You all know this about me. I worked for years with Ale Forney Center in Manhattan. And tonight in New York City there are about 9,000 homeless children on the streets. Most are sex working now and drug working. About 60% of them are queer. About 50% of them are brown or black. very disproportionate in terms of the population of the 5 boroughs. And Ali Forney is a Black, probably we would now say non-binary person. Did fully transition, but clearly not in the camp that the people thought he would be in. He was arrested, and when he was arrested, he was taken to the Catholic home for the night to sleep, and unfortunately, he handed them his ID, which he had to, his school ID, and it showed that he was male. And so they put him in the male dormitory. And when they came in the morning, his jawbone was separated from his face. From other kids. So, you know, we all have this protection because we're pretty privileged to be here in this room, you know, in the spaces that we move around in. But just right under the surface is incredible violence to our community. And the violence that's done us here intellectually is pretty intense. You don't get to read and work in queer theory or critical race theory unless you find a sympathetic teacher. But you're gonna have a lot more time with Thomas Aquinas than James Baldwin. May not even ever read anything like Baldwin or Virginia Woolf. Or take them seriously anyway. So, you know, I've spent a career here, I'm leaving, and you have moved it. The students have moved race and gender and queerness in substantial ways, and I think that you're at this time where, you know, it's really important that this work, this existential work, take place. That those questions find some community way of responding to them. That the community gets to talk about this. Who are we? What are we here for? Besides the baccalaureate. Where do we come from? Yeah.
I wanted to add to your point about the things that we read and learn here. In my Christian ethics class, we talk about ethics regarding sexuality in the eyes of Christianity. And even the reading that we do that tries to reason for support of non-heteronormative sexuality is so, when I was reading it, my brain went, well, this just isn't very in it, I suppose is the way to describe it. It wasn't even written by a queer person, and you could tell by the way that they wrote, by the way that they talked about it. It wasn't a queer eye looking at this situation, it was a heteronormative person writing about us. And this actually brings up something we were talking about today about racial justice in my Christian ethics class. The idea of not doing anything regarding us without us being in the process. Which is so ironic when in the exact same class we were reading a piece trying to garner the fact that it is ethical in a way to be different in the heteronormative specter of things, while also not even talking to queer people at all about it. And it just did not have the soul of some of the books that we read in this class, the actual mind of a queer person. It just wasn't there.
Right.
So even when you talk about it here, in the one class that we've spoken about it, it was one class that doesn't really even hit the surface, and it wasn't even a queer person talking about it.
What are you thinking, others of you? I mean, is it the time to kind of get out of the abstraction and look at what passes for queer politics and queer religion and queer psychology? Queer churches, queer synagogues. Have we become a new kind of queer bagman for either the Democratic or the Republican Party? Yeah.
Well, it's very, I have a lot of complicated thoughts, but like, I think that if I'm talking about purpose or like the meaning of like what queerness suggests or like what it does is I see it as like individual impact or like the existence being like reason enough almost. Like I don't think that existence should be defined, but what our existence does is the definition.
Yeah.
So like I know like from just like my experience that like people who know me and know me personally have a different perspective on the world than others who don't. Like I think that's something that's very powerful. Like because even if they don't get it, they still know. You know what I mean? Like they've
been there.
Yeah, they don't have to tap into the consciousness, but they've been exposed. And so I feel like there's this idea where the problem lies in the attempt to conform because there is no longer this dissonance or this dissent that is being flaunted or being present towards other people. I think that the tragedy of conformity and the tragedy of this need to have safety, because like so many, like I live my life motivated by the need for safety, but what it does is that it removes the impact and the influence that you have on daily life.
That's right.
And I think that
Which maybe its intention.
it is, I think, for a lot of people. But but queerness is so, I think it's more powerful than that because we see every day how queerness is a defining aspect of humanity. Like queerness is a thing which influences every single aspect of everything that we consume every day. And maybe some of that is like fetishization or commodification, but like the culture and the art and the things that people consume and the people that disapprove of us even are consuming our ideas and our culture, and that is in itself an impact. And so I think that there's a battle between when the battle between fear and conformity and self-expression, it's the fear that gets in the way.
Yeah.
Because self-expression in many ways is revolutionary.
Yeah. Martin Duberman, who's a scholar for many years at Columbia, wrote that it's not that gay marriage is wrong, it's that marriage is wrong. You know, because it is male-centric. Now, is love wrong? No. Is sexual attraction wrong? Is commitments for long periods of time and is our children or family? None of that is wrong. But the conditions of the contract and of the cultural expression is harmful. And Duman wrote that marriage was a strategic allotment made by heteronormative culture to marginalize queer thinking. And there's a lot to that. But, you know, I think also when the reality is that's how you're going to get some rights, that when you're my age, if you don't have, you're screwed. Right? And that's a setup. That's a setup. It's a setup for heterosexual people who want to live a certain way and have romantic and meaningful and powerful relationships, but not engage in that contract. That legal contract. Have contracts of different sorts, but that legal contract. You know, and I think, again, all of this begins like with this organization and its willingness to be ribald and to be, you know, kind of troublemakers and really creative, fun, but also to recognize kind of the existential import of this level of privilege, even if it's all on borrowed money, which, you know, queer people outside of the stereotype of the white cisgender gay guy, hello, but the idea is, I mean, it's a much poorer crowd economically than racial poverty when you compare apples to apples. And it's because of outside of these bubbles, it's very vulnerable. Someone can lose jobs, be arrested, lose housing, all of those things very easily. I don't know, so I pitch it back to you, and I think it's a really important question for the group and for myself to consider. Beyond listening to me, but taking, the time to really get to what are we here for? What is this association capable of? And I saw the Black community, with the help of a lot of queer people, move a lot of money a couple of years back after many years of being stepped on. It's still not done, but at least people are ashamed to be against it. We're the next. We're the next, and I think it's all in your hands. What do you think? And what is existence here? Is it honest? Is existence honest here for queer people? Is it like the space that we talk about when we go to the ghettos? I mean, is it gay air? I don't feel that. I think that we can sound out a little bit more space. We can sound out a bit more space. Reactions? Thoughts? Yeah.
I think it all just comes back to the balancing of what is given to us, what is expected of us, and what is willing to be sacrificed. Like, I think that, like, coming from like what you said, like a position of such privilege, there is a sharp and very strong need, like personally, to try to do something more and do something bigger. But I think that this is like a universal experience amongst probably every minority and like all
People?
all people.
Well, I would certainly consider, the research shows that as outsiders, but you know, the research is very clear that queer people, because of oppression, which would include any outsider group, have a unique potential within them to experience nature and other beings not as objects to be manipulated and mastered, but as subjects. There's a sense of equanimity that happens because of the experience of oppression.
Yeah.
That I know something about you, even not knowing something about you. I know something about you. You've survived in this way. You've mastered this. And that is to be respected. It's to be cherished. And the gift of this subject capacity is equality. And I think for a long time, the queer people have been trying to minimize our differences from heteronormative folk, from binary folk, to kind of minimize our differences. And that's an act of survival. I now think for the first time in history, at least in our environment, black and brown and queer and non-binary people have the ability to maximize the difference. To maximize the difference, to dress the difference, to speak in the classroom to the difference, to move the conversation outside of a heteronormative voice. Just asking the questions. Maximizing our differences is an act of love. It is not necessarily for us to see ourselves as oppositional. Because we know enough about social science, you are all experts in that so much of what is considered heteronormative is social construction. I'm not so sure there's a great deal of happiness over there if I have to work my entire life so that I have 10 years of retirement at a pissy poor Social Security number. You know, I think that it is the living in this expanded way that moves the equation, and that's radical. And it doesn't have to be what we had to do, which was, you know, spit on a cop. And threaten to out people. You know, like all these ridiculous priests. Bunch of closet fags. But it doesn't do any good to out them because it's contrary to our own ethics. Until they start attacking us. And that's not y'all's. You didn't get those cards. You have different cards. In a way, much more seductive cards. Because you can more than survive. But I don't think that's why we're here. And that's certainly not where we came from. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, as you know, says that all the time. That the black man's choice is love. And that will scare the hell out of white men. They want him to be the caricature, to prove their virtue. They want us, you saw the cartoons. That's what they want from us. You know? We can shave our legs long enough so that the straight men can begin thinking they can shave their legs too. Right? I mean, it's just this kind of like we're like the canaries. They're there. There's a lot more that's available. Yeah? What are you thinking? Maximizing instead of surviving. You know, I think that's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. I've done that here. You know, I've pissed them off. And, but I also have very good friends. You know, who are here. So, you know, I'm happy to have this conversation, and I hope you take it into your places. You know, who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? And this remedy of maximizing. That's really your generation's, it's been gifted. You know, I've always been amazed, because I'm a queer magnet, right? So I get all the queer kids in my classes. And I've always been amazed by those that come out. And I'm so grateful that they could, right? And even if they only do it in the writing, like even all of their crowd still doesn't know, or doesn't at least let them know what they know, so that there's a place where they could write about that and read somebody who else was that way. You know, it's been incredible. And I have students that are 15 and 20 and 30 years out of undergraduate who are living big queer lives. You know, big troublemakers and big lovers of this way. It's an incredible gift. This spirit. The Lakota call it Wink Day. And it means, it doesn't really translate, but it's a place and it's a consciousness. And the medicine of the Wink Day is the spider. The tonke, the spider who weaves both chaos and order. And the Lakota and many of the indigenous tribal peoples of the North and South and Central Americas didn't necessarily have an identity for what we would call queer people, and they allowed people just to be fit where they fit, with a piece of cloth, and they put it in the tree, as the way of praying for the ways that no one sees, but that the spider weaves. And that always makes sense to me. Right? Made sense to me. So good luck weaving.